The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome everybody. I realize that it's a minute past the hour, but we literally have hundreds and hundreds of people signed up, and I can see the little number ticker is still climbing, so people are still logging in. So I think we're going to call this the official 2-minute warning. When my system clock is showing 3 minutes after the hour, then we will officially go ahead and start, and hopefully everybody's all logged in by then. In the meantime, I would ask a favor of everybody. I always like to do a quick technology check and make sure that everything is working before we start. So if you can see the slide that says creating a modern documentation portal, that's the first part of the title. And if you can hear my voice, if you can give me a quick yes in either the chat window or the Q&A window, okay, I am broadcasting, all good. All right, 1-minute warning at this point. I'm showing 10:02. When my system clock is showing 10:03, we are going to go ahead and start and roll right in. Anybody who isn't logged in by then, they're just going to have to catch up with us. So 1-minute warning. All right, welcome everybody. I decided to go ahead and use my cam this time for giggles. That way some folks who haven't met me at any of the conferences get a chance to see who this crazy person talking is. But welcome. As you can see by the slide, the official title for this webinar, it's going to be part 2 in a series, creating a modern documentation portal that will wow your customers and improve customer experiences. That's a really long title that basically distills down to, how do I make my pages look good? And the short answer, Cascading Style Sheets. Some of you have heard me present over the years. I'm kind of beating a drum here. You've probably heard me say it before, but I meet hundreds of Flare users every year, and the big difference between the power Flare user and the average Flare user isn't how well they know Flare. The power user has also learned a bit about the cascading style sheet language. CSS is truly the secret sauce to unlocking advanced layout and design in Flare. Now, if you're following along, the first session that we did last month was an introduction to the CSS language. You know, what is it? Who invented it? Why does it exist? Kind of things. Well, now that we have those fundamentals behind us, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm supposed to do some housekeeping here. One, this webinar will be recorded. So before anybody asks, yes, it will be available after the fact up on the website. However, you may have noticed all of your microphones on your computers, your telephones, however you're logged in, they are on mute. So your privacy is protected. If you have any questions, you can always use the question and answer panel. I have a second monitor up. I can see that in the corner of my eye, so I should be able to catch any questions that come in. So ask questions whenever you want. But now picking up where I left off, so this session, part 2, we're going to look specifically at text. It's called fonts and beyond. So not just basic text. I mean, yeah, I want my text to be green. I want my text to be Verdana. Yeah, we're going to cover that. But way beyond that, how do I adjust indents? How do I adjust margins? How do I control, spacing above or below paragraphs? All of that advanced text functionality, we're going to drill down and learn a lot of best practices here today. All right, so jumping right in. Now, at this point, we've done the introductions. Mike Hamilton here. For those who don't know me, been in the industry much longer than I care to admit, but we're going to focus on the content now. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera back off. All right, so digging into fonts and beyond. Now, in case anybody missed the first session, like 3 slides of a quick overview. So we're going to do a quick CSS review, super fast. Then we're going to dig into fonts and font families. And if right now you're scratching your head saying, okay, I know what a font is, but what's a font family? Then you need that section. Seriously. Font sizing. I know it sounds silly, but so many people are doing it wrong. So we're going to take a pretty deep dive into how we do font sizing, both for print and web environments. Then we're going to look at the box model. And once again, if you know what I'm talking about there, then you're probably already well versed. If you're saying the box what? Oh my gosh, do you need this section then? The box model is how we control all white space in Flare. Box model adjustments and controls, and then that's going to wrap up this particular webinar. And I know that might not look like a long list, but we're going to be pressed to get all of this in 1 hour. Question in the chat window, will you be talking about responsive design? Obliquely, yes. We will not be covering specific responsive design techniques in this session. When we finish this session, when we get to part 4, that is when we will be specifically speaking to some responsive design techniques in Flare. The first session was all about fundamentals. This session is all about controlling text. The third session in January is going to be about controlling graphics. And then the fourth session in this series is going to be kind of, okay, how do we put it all together now? And a big part of that will be responsive design. Good question, though. All right, so jumping right into the short review. Again, for the deep dive, you can go ahead and watch that first hour that we did. But what are cascading style sheets? In a nutshell, it's simply a text file. It is separate from all of our topics. And the whole purpose is we want to completely separate content from design. We want to completely separate content from formatting. Our topics contain our content. All of our design, all of our formatting should live entirely in that cascading style sheet text file. Now, the rules in that cascading style sheet text file, they have 2 parts, a selector and a declaration. Basically, the selector says, what are we trying to control? The declaration is, what should it look like? Now, a little more detail on that If we bring up a very typical style rule, like you would find in a style sheet, in this case, H1, that would be the selector. That is the item we're trying to control. And then inside the curly brackets, that would be our declaration. How should the H1 appear? Well, in this case, font weight bold. Now, even that declaration can be broken down into two parts. There's the property, what specific attribute of that H1 are we trying to change, and then what we are changing it to. Question, can you provide your book recommendations for CSS? I sure will, and that's the very last slide I'm going to show at the very end of this session. Good question. All right, so every rule for controlling your styles, if you go to look at your style sheet, it's going to be set up in this fashion. Now, obviously, when you interact with the Flare style sheet editor, Flare is writing all of this for you behind the scenes, but it's still important to understand just kind of what Flare is doing. Now, to take this a step further, what if in that declaration you want to set bold, you want to set a color? You can have more than one property value pair inside of a declaration. And then you would see the example below. Here we have H1, font weight bold, semicolon, color black. So we can string as many property value pairs together as we need in a single declaration. All right, and then finally, to wrap this up, the syntax. So in the style sheet, if we start talking about what you would think of as a custom style, that's officially known as a class in CSS lingo. So first we have the selector, and then we have the name of the class. So that would be in the style sheet. Then if you were to look at the code of one of your topics, in the topic itself in the code, you would have a paragraph type element inside that opening tag, class equals, and the name of the class. So here we have the selector, and then once again, the class name. For a style in your style sheet to apply to the visible topic, it has to be a double match. The selector in the style sheet has to match the type of element. The class name in the style sheet has to match the class equals statement in that element on the page. In this case, because they both match, then this text here would become blue text with a 3-pixel margin left. This declaration would now apply to the text in this paragraph. If the class name did not match, if the selector did not match, then no, these style attributes would not apply. All right, so if that went way too fast and you're going, what does he talk? Go back, watch that first hour-long webinar. Again, this was just a refresher for those who did see the previous seminar. This is just a quick review. Question in the chat window, does the order of properties matter? Officially, no. Unofficially, it can. And I don't want to get too bogged down, but it's not supposed to matter. But I have found in certain browsers, it can. Now, that's really a quirk or a bug for that particular browser because it's not supposed to matter. But I have run into cases where everything works great, in Chrome and in Firefox, and then all of a sudden it stumbles in Safari. But if I change the order of the properties, well, now it works everywhere. That's not supposed to be true, but We kind of have to live in the real world. So the order of properties is not supposed to matter, but unfortunately, sometimes it does. And there are entire websites dedicated to defining the quirks in various browsers. All right, finally, the three CSS implementations. There's external, embedded, and inline CSS. The only one that we ever want to use is external, meaning that all of our styles live in our external style sheets. We don't want to use embedded styles, and we definitely don't want to use inline style formatting. In other words, don't highlight text and click the bold button. Ooh, heebie-jeebies. We would actually create a proper character style in the style sheet. Why is that text bold? It's bold because it is a interface element. Great. We create a character style, a span style named interface element. We apply that to the text, not the bold button. All right, so get rid of my little scribbles here. And that's going to be taking care of the review. Now for the new stuff that we didn't cover in that first webinar. And the first discussion, fonts and font families. I see a question in the chat window. It would be great to have some links to those websites. I agree. I actually used to have those links in some slides. Unfortunately, those websites tend to come and go every couple of years. So lists of links like that tend to get they tend to go stale fairly quickly. One that is a good standby is W3 Schools. That is one that's been around forever. I apologize. I probably should have added it to one of my slides here, but whenever in doubt, W3 Schools is a good resource. It's really broken into two parts. One part of W3 Schools is a CSS reference for those who are learning CSS. The other part of W3 Schools is kind of a set of lookup pages. It's like, okay, what browser does this CSS work in, and what browser should I be aware of? So that's why I like W3 Schools. It kind of has both sides. Question from Mary. Can you show an example not using inline text, please? Yeah, I suppose we have time for that very quickly. Pulling up a copy of Flare here. If I just open a random topic, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit, make it easier for you guys to see. For whatever reason, let's say marketing wants the word information to be bold. The incorrect way would be to highlight that text, come up here to the home ribbon, and click the bold button. I mean, does it work? Yes. However, I have just set myself up for maintenance problems in the future. What I should do instead, I'm going to hit the undo button here, so that is back to normal text. Instead, I should go to the style sheet. Once I have the style sheet editor open, keyword, tricky phrase, how do I add a new style? I'm going to click this button here labeled Add Selector. Remember, a selector is what we plan to control, so we're going to add a new selector. I click that button, and there's two parts to this. What element am I trying to control? Well, in this case, I'm trying to do character control, and this was from the first webinar we did last month. Character styles, you just kind of have to learn this, but that is what's known as a span. So I'll choose a span element. Now for the unique name. And you don't want to call this bold. The real question, we want to be semantic about this. Why am I making this text bold? Is it a book title? Is it a place name? Does marketing want all software interface elements to be bold? Well, then let's name this interface element. So once I've chosen span for a character style, I've given it a class name. Okay, why is it going to be bold? I click OK. Style sheet already contain. Okay, I already have that style in here, so we'll do interface element number 56. I know that's not in there. So Flare is now adding this new character style to my style sheet. And right now I'm seeing this huge, massive list of styles. But if we scroll down, there it is right there. Span.interface element number 56. Well, now we're going to adjust how it styles content. That's the selector and its class name. Now we're going to add the declaration portion. I'm just going to double click on that new selector. And here's where I can go in. I can set a font, I can set a size, but in this case, I just want it to be bold. And click OK. So you might think, boy, that was a lot of work. Well, you only ever have to do that one time. From this day forward, now that it's in my style sheet, I can just go select the word information. And instead of clicking the bold button, I now apply the style span dot interface element. And it looks the way that marketing wants it to look. Now, at this point, you're probably saying, well, why go to all that trouble? Well, what if I've done that now in 1,000 topics, and next year marketing changes their mind? Yeah, we don't really like interface elements being bold anymore. We would be much happier if they were italic and underlined. Well, if you were clicking that bold button in 1,000 places, you're stuck now. You have to go back and hand edit all 1,000 locations one by one. It's going to take forever. But if you've done it the way I just suggested, and marketing changes their mind, well, all I have to do is go to my style sheet, open that one style that we created. I'll double click on it, and I'll change it from bold to italic, choose underline, click OK. And now when I go back to my topic, well, now everywhere that it was bold, it's now italic and underlined, but in thousands of locations. So that's the big advantage. This is why we don't ever want to just, embed formatting in the topic. We're setting us up for a maintenance nightmare in the future. But by using proper styles, I can do a complete rebrand of a document literally in minutes, even if it's tens of thousands of pages. I hope that helps. Again, that was kind of a review, kind of an overview, but now we're going to jump into the new stuff. All right. So back to font family. So if that's a new phrase for you, just what do I mean when I talk about a font family? And I should preface, this is only applicable to publishing for the web browser. If you're publishing to PDF, then you do not want to use a font family. You just pick the one font, the one typeface that you want. But if you are publishing something like HTML5, then you need a font family. It's a list of primary and alternate fonts for styles used in your topics. And the moment I say that, people start to freak out. What do you mean alternate fonts? Marketing says I must use the font Crazy Mike Blue Tuesday Purple. Well, guess what? You're free to use that font, and it's going to look beautiful on your computer because you have that font installed. But what typically happens is you'll build HTML5, you'll push it up to the server, and then when your customer tries to look at it, guess what? They don't have that crazy marketing font installed on their computer. What happens? If that font doesn't exist on your customer's machine, then your customer's browser does a substitution. And I don't know about you guys, but my content does not look good when rendered in Comic Sans. And if there's going to be a font substitution, I do not want to rely on a web browser just randomly picking whatever font that it wants. That's the purpose of a font family. We have to recognize we can't use crazy fonts that may not be on the customer's machine, at least not, and rely on them working. So if there's going to be a substitution, we want to control that. So hence the font family. Now there's a strategy to this though. Font family guidelines. You typically want to choose your primary font. I mean, yeah, go with that crazy font marketing wants. There is a chance that it will be on your customer's machine. Slim chance, but a chance. But then we have to add a safety net. We then define secondary fonts based on the fonts we know are installed on the various operating systems. So I'll choose the marketing font first, but then I will list an acceptable substitution that I know is on Windows. And then I will list an acceptable substitution that I know is on a Macintosh, and on and on. But then we back that up even further. There are what are called generic font guidelines. And this is built into the CSS specification. You can just say sans serif. What you're basically telling the browser is, look, I've told you the fonts that I want. If for some reason none of those are available, and we're at a point where I have no idea what this device is, well then please use whatever the sans serif system font is on this device. You know, in case it's like a washing machine with a screen in it or something crazy. Some questions in the chat window. Which style sheet does Flare add by default? Every Flare project has a style sheet by default. It's typically your project name.css, but you can override that. You can change the name and you can add new ones. How does Flare deal with font families when publishing PDF? One, you should never try to send a font family to a PDF. If you do by accident, Flare is just going to choose the first font that you have defined in the font family. So Flare's just going to ignore everything after that. Where do you define a font family list? In the CSS editor in Flare? And then question, can we not package the required font in the Flare HTML5 output? Only if you want your company to be sued out of existence. That is a huge problem. I don't go into it in this session because it's almost an obsolete technique already. But one of the things that was added with the CSS3 specification was the ability not to package fonts with HTML5, but to load fonts onto your web server And then when your customer's browser downloads your topics, it can also download the fonts. Oh, sounds wonderful. Well, except there be dragons. If marketing purchased that font more than 3 years ago, then I can almost guarantee they don't have the legal rights to put that font on their server and use it that way. And there are a bunch of companies that have gotten in trouble for that. There are literally like the CSS equivalent of ambulance chasing lawyers that just spend their time online looking for sites, downloading fonts. Then they'll research, did they ever purchase the right to do that? And if the answer is no, then they get nasty lawsuit. They're just annoying. They sue your company just for enough that they know you'll settle out of court. Again, it's like the web version of an ambulance chasing lawyer. So can that technically be done? Yes. But if you're going to do that, make sure that you have all of the legal licensing requirements in this place to be able to do that. It's not nearly as simple as like a PDF. So I'm going to touch on things like that at the end of this section, but for now I do want to focus on the font families because this is crazy simple. Anybody can do this. All right, so that's the guidelines. Now, you don't have to do the research. I've tried to help out here. If you go back to the very beginning, there are certain fonts that have been installed on every copy of Windows that has ever shipped. And that's the list on screen right now. I wasn't able to go back quite as far on the Macintosh side. I wasn't able to find reference data on the old green screen Macs, but from color Macs to present day, here is a list of the fonts that were common on all of the Mac systems. And you can also use that for Linux support as well. Then if we look at Android devices, much more limited, but still a full set. Now you may notice I don't have a column here for iPhones or iPads. And that's because Apple really kind of goofed this one up, especially in like the first 6 generations of iPhones and iPads. Apple literally changed the fonts with every single device generation. They're typically in the Helvetica family, but where like the iPhone 1 used Helvetica, the iPhone 2 used Helvetica Neue, N-E-U-E, whatever that is. Then it was iPhone version 3, they used Helvetica Light. It's like they kept using permute. So iPads and iPhones tend to be typically, if you just call Helvetica, then you're usually safe with those early iDevices. So that you almost have to research in a separate website. But if you were to choose a font from each of these 3 lists, then you're pretty much guaranteed that one of those is going to be available on that device. Now, some recommended font families, ones that I have used in my career. A very safe one, I especially like this for like heading sizes. Arial, known Windows font. Helvetica, you're good for Mac and Linux OSs. Roboto, that's my preferred for an Android device, especially a tablet. And then if all 3 of those fail, then the backup would just be the generic sans serif. Now, I happen to not like that for body text. On Windows, instead of Arial, I prefer Helvetica. But you got to be careful. Helvetica didn't exist on early versions of the OS. But you can have more than one per operating system. So it's not uncommon for me to do Verdana. If that's not available, then fall back to Arial, then Helvetica, Roboto, sans serif. Now, if you want to, now again, We're talking about the web browser here, but if you wanted to do something that looked more like newsprint online, then Times New Roman, Times, Droid Serif, and then Serif would be a good choice. And then if you ever need to do like a code sample, then Courier New, Courier, Droid Sans Mono, and Monospace. That would be a good family as well. Question from Edna. If you're importing Google fonts, is it still necessary to set up a font family? Edna is looking at a crystal ball because I was going to go to Google Fonts next. I would suggest yes. Now, it should not be necessary, but in case, the Google Font Foundry were suddenly to go down for maintenance, well, then your customer's browser might need to do a substitution. If Google suddenly changes its mind and takes the Font Foundry offline, that could mess with. So even using things like Google Fonts or cloud-based fonts, I would still set up a font family. Now, I'm getting several questions in the chat window. Apparently, people are like, where do you do this in Flare? We didn't even know this existed. I hadn't planned on showing that, and yikes, time is getting away from me, but what the heck, let's do it. I'm going to pull Flare back up again. If you go into the style sheet editor to create a font family like we're describing, we'll create one very quickly. We're going to go to the options in the local toolbar. When I click on the options button, one of my options is manage font sets. We'll go ahead and click on manage font sets. This will bring up a list of any font sets you've already created. We're going to create a new one here. I'll click the little green plus sign at the bottom. And we're going to name this new font set Webinar. So I've named my font set. All right, now let's do that fancy Verdana Arial one I showed earlier. Whatever font you want first, I'm just going to scroll down. I'm going to locate Verdana in my list of fonts on this machine. There's Verdana. Click the little arrow. Okay, Verdana is now the first choice in my list. Now I'm going to scroll up to the letter A, and I'm going to grab Arial. Arial is now my second choice. For my third choice, I want a Macintosh font. I want Helvetica. So I'm going to scroll down to the letter H. Uh-oh. Well, I'm on a Windows machine. These are Windows fonts. I don't have Helvetica. No big deal. As long as you look up and get the spelling correct, you can just type it in up here at the top, capital H, Helvetica, and then press that right arrow again. So now we've got Verdana, Arial, Helvetica. And then I want to do Roboto, which is the Android font. Again, I'm not going to find that in my list, so I'm manually going to type that in. Roboto, right arrow. And then at the very top of the list of fonts, I want to use that generic. So I'm just going to come up here and locate Sans Serif, add that one to the list. So this is now the order that web browser is going to try and use. Once I'm happy with this list, I click OK. You can now see this new webinar font set is available. Click OK. And now anywhere in Flare, when you can select an individual font, you can actually choose that font set instead. Now that I have multiple font sets, how does the CSS know which one to use? Oh, well, you have to tell it. So, for example, if I decide that I want to use that brand new font set that we just created on my body selector. I double click on body. That will bring it up in the editor. Up here at the top where it says font, I'll delete whatever is there. And then I can come down here to defined font sets. So instead of choosing an individual font, I'll choose that webinar font set we just created. You can see it populate up here and then click OK. So just creating the font set is not enough. You then have to tell Flare where it should be used. All right, that put us probably 10 minutes behind on this webinar, but from the questions that came in, it sounds like that was critical for you guys, so I'm glad we did it, but we're going to push ahead now. So some example font families that I have used. I just gave you that sample how we did body, and I used, a font family that was going to give me a sans serif look. But then in the same style sheet, if you need to show code examples, I could create a selector of P, a class name of code, and then we could use monospace type fonts as well. So now whenever I apply the style p.code, well, that section has that code look to it. So the summary: take control of the fonts that you use on your content and don't let browsers make uncontrolled substitutions. All right, so that's the official part of this section. The unofficial part, this is more cutting edge, but if I pull up my web browser right now, if you go up to the URL fonts.google.com, there is a brandy new technique where you can actually pull cloud-based fonts into your customer's browser in real time. Now, the advantage to this, because I didn't load these onto my server, I'm not really stealing from anybody, I can't get in trouble. These are fonts that Google has made available to the world free of charge. And you can just, scrounge around in here until you find a typeface, a font that you really like. Now, this goes above and beyond what we can cover here, but if you go up to fonts.google.com, in the About section and in the Articles section, they have all the instructions necessary on how to do this. Fair warning, it will require you to copy and paste some actual code. So for example, maybe I really like this font, Montserrat. If I click on Montserrat on the Google site, that will take me to the Montserrat page. Then I can come down and maybe I don't need all of these. I just need regular 400 here. Well, then over on the right where it says select this style, that will pop out. I choose @import. And if I copy this code and I paste that in the code of my style sheet, well, that is now going to let me pull these Google fonts in real time down into my customer's browser. So if you want to go above and beyond, that's some additional research you can do. That is also a valid technique, but one that won't get you into trouble. All right, now font metrics. This is another one of those things that everybody thinks they know, and then they realize, oh my gosh, it's not what I thought. So when we talk about font size, that's really a pretty meaningless number. All that tells me is how much physical space do I need for a particular bit of text. If we start dissecting it though, What we know as font size is actually a combination of additional values. Now, without getting deep into fontography here, it's all based on what's called the baseline. The baseline would be under your capital letters. The next major value would be the top of your lowercase letters, like the letter G, the letter X, or the hump on the letter H. And that value is known as the X height. Beyond the X height, if we then go to the very tippy top of the tallest character, that is the ascender. And then if we go from the baseline down to the lowest point of any character, well, that is the descender. Now, why do we care? Well, if you add the ascender, the X height, and the descender together, that is how you get font size. So once again, the only thing font size tells me is how much physical space is necessary. Font size tells you nothing about readability, legibility, or usability. And so that's why it drives me nuts. There are entire Facebook groups devoted to technical writers, LinkedIn groups devoted to technical writers. And at least once every 18 months, there's this giant argument that flares up. What's the ideal body text size? And one group starts screaming 8 point. Another group starts screaming, are you crazy? It's got to be 10 point. My eyes are old. I can't read 8 point. And they argue back. It's the most worthless argument ever because both sides are wrong. And I'll prove it. I'm going to bring up two separate fonts side by side. Now, if you had to take a guess, you have like half a second to figure out which of these is bigger. Go. And too late. Well, your gut instinct is to say that the left is larger. Times New Roman is larger. But it's not. They're both exactly 32 point. I mean, if you were to break out a ruler right now and measure your computer screen, every line is the exact same width. All of those lines together vertically are the exact same height. They're both 32 point. So why does the one on the left just feel bigger? Well, because Times New Roman is physically built differently than Garamond. If we zoom in and we put them side by side, Times New Roman has a huge X height, but relatively tiny ascenders and descenders, whereas Garamond has a much smaller X height, but much larger ascenders and descenders. So what does that mean in the real world? Well, it means they both take up the exact same amount of space. However, Times New Roman will be easier to read. That larger X height gives us better usability. Whereas the Garamond, it feels more formal. And that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. It all depends on the kind of the feel you're going for in your documentation. But the reason I make a big deal out of it here, don't let marketing pull a switcheroo on you. If all of your documentation right now is, in fact, in Garamond, and you've been doing it that way for 4 years, and then marketing decides, ooh, we're going to switch to Tahoma. You're doing that CSS thing, right? That's just going to take you a minute. Ooh, pump the brakes. We actually have to do some comparisons there. If we were simply to switch from Garamond to Tahoma, yes, that's a technically easy thing to do, but we could be ruining the readability, the usability of our documents. Making a switch from font A to font B means we might have to increase the font size a little bit to get the same legibility, the same usability. And that has side effects. If we're currently paying for our documents to be printed and we're getting a 32-page manual right now, while switching from Garamond to Tahoma and increasing the font size, that might add an additional 4 pages to each manual. And if we're printing 10,000 manuals per quarter, well, someone's going to have to absorb that cost of that extra 40,000 pages that we're publishing now. So when marketing tries to say, yeah, just switch fonts, not so fast. You kind of have to push back in that use case. All right, now that entire discussion was kind of a setup for where we're going next. How should we be doing sizing in our web browser? Oh, and this is just what I mentioned verbally. You also have slides for that if you want to have a copy of the slides after the fact. So again, this gets back to that argument. Should it be 8-point? Should it be 10-point? Well, it depends. What font are you using? If you're using Times New Roman, you could probably get away with 8-point, whereas if you're using Garamond, you probably need 10-point just to get the same usability. All right, but here's what this was all setting up for. When we're publishing in Flare, how do we set up our font sizing? According to the CSS specification, there are 3. Now notice the slide, I said there are 2.5 ways, but officially there's 3 ways to define font sizes in CSS. There's fixed font sizing, physical font sizing, which I refuse to give full credit because it is the worst idea on the planet. And then the third method is called relative font sizing. Never ever do physical font sizing, but you may need to do both fixed and relative. So we're going to look at each of those individually. All right, so fixed font sizing. Notice the parentheses. If you are publishing to Microsoft Word, to PDF, to anything that is print-centric, then you should only be using fixed font sizing. Basically, a fixed font size is anything that you could go to a high-end stationery store and purchase a ruler in those units. So points, picas, inches, millimeters, those are all established fixed font sizes. Awesome for doing PDF. Never use them to control text size when publishing for a web browser. Tons of problems with that. One that just affects everybody is that Mac versus Windows. They literally have different default sizing values at the base of their operating system. So if you get text looking really good on your Windows machine, and then you try to run it on a Mac, it shrinks, and now you need a magnifying glass. If you get it looking really good on the Mac, and then you load it in a browser on Windows, well, it grows, and now it looks cartoonish. So huge problems from a usability perspective trying to use something like point sizes when establishing sizes for a web browser. Now, not included on this slide, but even beyond that, if you need to support responsive design, or even more importantly, accessibility, meaning your pages have to be available to people with visual disabilities, using a point size can cause you to fail in accessibility review. So fixed font sizing, we love it, but only for PDF publishing. Then we get to physical font sizing, which I say never use. This was a great idea 25 years ago. This is sizing text based on pixels. And back when everybody had a 14-inch monitor, and they were these big, thick tube monitors, and they were all the exact same resolution, that made sense. But now fast forward where some Retina display iPhones have a higher resolution than some laptop displays, and it makes no sense anymore. So trying to rely on pixel sizes is just, in this modern world, a recipe for disaster. So abandon the idea of using pixels. Finally, we get to relative font sizing. This is what should always be used if you are publishing for a web browser. This is also what you must use if you're trying to get responsive design, something that will automatically adapt between a desktop display, a tablet display, and a smartphone display. This is sizing your text using a value that is relative to a default size that is built into the web browser. And all the web browser companies, they've all had a big powwow meeting. That default size is identical across every browser, no matter who makes it, and even across the various operating systems. So if I want my text to be, 80% of that default size, then I could literally use the value 80%. And not only will it be identical, Safari, Opera, Firefox, Mac, Windows, very consistent. Now, there are different relative sizing schemes you can use. I list them all in this slide, but really the only two that are in widespread use are percentages and M units. Now, the only difference between those two is you literally move the decimal point 2 places. So 100% is the same thing as 1 M unit. 80% is the exact same thing as 0.8 M units. All right, so those are relative sizes. We love relative sizes if we're publishing to browsers. Question in the chat window. I was looking at my own style sheet, and I do see things like pixel or point used for setting things like margins. Is that okay? That is actually okay. Notice everything I'm talking about here is sizing of text itself. When it comes to white space around the text, well, then you can use any value you want. But sizing the text itself, we want to avoid fixed for the web browser. Question, are M and REM the same? Sort of. I'm going to get to that here in a moment. All right, so my gosh, we have 2 minutes. We're going to go about 10 minutes long here. I apologize, but we did add a couple of demos I hadn't planned on doing. All right, hang in with me here. So if you've never used relative fonts before, here's something I recommend. If you want to practice, go into your style sheet, go to your body style, and set its default size to 100%. Then in that very same style sheet, set your heading 1 to be 120%, your heading 2 to be 115%, heading 3, 110%. It's going to look cartoony. It's going to be much too large, but it's a good place to start. If you've never worked with relative sizes before, those are nice, even round numbers you can start with, and then you can start making adjustments. So that's a recommendation. But if you're like most people, you're going to run into a problem. Relative font sizing caution. Watch out for the funhouse mirror effect. Now, this is indicative of a poorly written style sheet. So it's not uncommon for this to happen. What happens is, if you remember from the first webinar we did, I talked about style inheritance. And in CSS, elements will inherit the properties of their parent elements. So if I have a paragraph that is inside body, and if body is set to 10 point, well, the paragraph automatically becomes 10 point. It inherits from its parent. And if we're producing PDF and using point sizes, there's usually no problem. The problem is when you get into relative sizes, you can actually get this multiplication happening, and that can cause your text to shrink or expand very quickly. So basically what I'm talking about here, I have mocked up the code you might find in a sample topic. And if you look at this, I have two paragraphs inside of a list item. The list item is inside of an unordered list, which is inside of a div, which is inside of body. So we have a ton of inheriting going on here. Now, if we're going to PDF, we're going to use point sizes. So maybe this is my style sheet. Body, font size 8 point. And then we'll set my font. Oh, and if I'm going to print, I shouldn't be doing a font family, but pretend I didn't say that. Heading 1, 16 point. Okay, nothing wrong so far. Div, font size 10 point. Okay, red flag. If I want my text to be 10 point, why didn't I just set 10 point on body? Why is this div different from the font size on body? I now have two styles fighting with each other. But now inside of div, we have these list items, and they're set to be 10 point. Another red flag. That's unnecessary. That li is already going to be inheriting from div. Why did I? And then p, somebody has now set to 10 point. So we have way too many styles set here. They're fighting, they're conflicting. But when you use fixed sizes, as a viewer, you don't notice. You render that page in the browser and it looks fairly normal. So that's why a lot of people like using point sizes. You can write a horrible style sheet and still get a decent output. Well, then it turns out they're using this for a web page, and then they fail an accessibility audit. And marketing orders them, you need to switch to relative sizes. Okay, great. But they don't really understand how it works, and they just literally switch every value. So then what happens? They change body to 80%, heading 1 to 120%. But they set the div again to 80%, the list item to 80%, and the P to 80%. But what they don't realize is they're now going to get the funhouse effect. Since P is inside Li, they're now going to get 80% of 80%. And the Li is inside of the div, so that's going to be of 80%. And the div is inside of, so body is going to give them of, so they're going to get 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8. What happens when they try to render this page? Well, now you need a microscope to try and read that interior text. Again, it's one of those silly, squiggly funhouse mirrors. What is the problem here? Well, the problem is somebody needs to learn how to write a proper style sheet. None of these styles needed to be written. The font size was set on body. That font size is going to automatically inherit into everything else anyways. So that's the challenge. Using point sizes, you can get away with a horrible style sheet, and it still kind of works. But then when you try to switch to relative and things go wonky, that's just a big red flag that means you probably have too many properties set in your style sheet. All right, so that brings us to a relatively new thing, the rem unit. So many people struggled with this that the W3C actually came up with a brand new relative unit. It's called the rem unit. It has all of the accessibility and the responsive design benefits of the M unit, but it does not inherit sizing from its parents the way a relative unit normally does. So when it comes to inheritance, it behaves like a fixed size. So if somebody didn't have time to really clean up their entire style sheet, but they needed to switch to relative units quickly, switching from point sizes to rem units, that actually gives you the benefits of both worlds. You're now in a relative size, but you're not going to get that funhouse mirror effect. Oh, and I see that note from Albert. In future sessions, well, sometimes you need the funhouse mirror effect in some places, but not others. Well, again, that's where you can use rem units. When you need to divorce yourself from that multiplication factor, use a rem unit. If you want the scaling of that multiplication factor, then use the traditional EM unit. But that's a brand new unit that was just added like 2 years ago by the W3C, just to address that funhouse mirror effect. Or as I like to say, the rem unit is the M unit with training wheels. Okay, I'm teasing a little bit there. All right, now the box model, and this is going to finish up this webinar, but this is the aha moment for a lot of people. If we have a page like I have on screen right now, you and I as humans, we see a heading and we see 2 paragraphs. That is not a question. If you use the rem unit, is that supported by all modern browsers? Yes, it is. I don't recall exactly how far back you would have to go for it not to be supported, but I do know that it is supported in Edge, Firefox, Safari, Opera, Chrome. You'd be hard pressed to find a browser that does not support rem units. All right, but back to what's on screen now. So you and I see a heading in 2 paragraphs. That's not what the computer sees. That is not what Flare sees. The computer just sees 3 elements. Really doesn't care what they are. And the computer sees something that we don't see. The computer can see a magical, invisible box around each of those elements. Now, this almost isn't even fair because we silly humans, we don't have X-ray vision. We can't see the invisible box. So what typically happens? You've got this page, and for whatever reason, marketing says, hey, we need all of this text hard left justified. We want that text right up against the edge of the page. So you jump into your style sheet and you start digging around and you find a property named margin. Aha, that's what we want. And you set margin to 0 and you click Save, and your text moves to the left. But does it move all the way? Nope. It moves halfway, and it stops right about here, and you still have a big gap. Ooh, that's not quite what we wanted. So we dig around in the style sheet some more, and we keep looking. We don't find anything else. So typically what people do, they go back to margin. They will set it to 0 again, but this time when they click Save, they'll click the mouse button harder, and it doesn't make a difference. Your text isn't going to move anymore. Well, you just run smack dab into the box model, and you didn't even realize it. So let me get rid of my scribbles here. Text and its spacing on screen requires not one, not even two, but three separate values. Remember those invisible boxes we couldn't see? Well, that invisible box has a width. It's literally called border. And it's not fair because we can't even see it, but it might be 1 pixel thick, 10 pixels thick. We can't tell until we look it up in the style sheet. But then above and beyond that, remember that margin value that we found? Well, it turns out that's not the edge of the page to the text. That is the edge of the page to the invisible box that we can't see. Now, what's inside the invisible box? Well, that's the third value. That's padding. And people say, but wait a minute, padding is in tables. In a word processor, it's in tables. In CSS, everything has padding. Your paragraphs, your headings, your images, everything has a padding value. So we have to get in the habit of adjusting all three of these values if we want to make adjustments to indents or white space or anything like that. Now, when we make those adjustments, they can either be set in total. I could say, margin 4 point. Well, that will give me 4 point of additional margin on all four sides. Or I could be more specific and I could say margin hyphen left 4 point, and then I only get 4 points of margin on the left-hand side. And that would be that red arrow. If I want an additional 4 points of padding as well, then that would be padding hyphen left 4 point. So you can control these different values. Now, common adjustments. To add an indent, as I said, you would typically adjust margin left. To increase the space above paragraphs, adjust margin top. To increase the space below paragraphs, that would be margin bottom. And then as an example, what if we want to just do a fancy effect? What if I want a line above and below, like a note? Well, in my style sheet, I've created a class of paragraph called lines. In the Flare editor, I tell Flare, hey, I want a bottom line that's black, solid in 1 pixel. Flare's going to write these 3 lines of code into my style sheet. I then go to the Flare editor and say, I also want a top line that's 1 pixel solid and black. Well, then Flare's going to write the next 3 lines into my style sheet. Now, if I go and apply the style p.lines, I get something that will look like this. Now, unfortunately, we're probably not done yet. Marketing looks at this and they're not happy. They're like, yeah, we want you to tidy this up a little bit. It almost looks like this text is leaking out from the lines a little bit. Isn't there a way you can indent that text a little bit? Well, indent is probably the wrong word there, because remember, there's that invisible box. Anything outside the invisible box is margin, but anything inside the invisible box is padding. So since there's a vertical line here, we can't see if I want that text to move to the right of the I want to increase the padding. So to make marketing happy, we're going to make an adjustment here. Same style, but I'm going to add some padding left and right values, some padding bottom and top values. Now when we render that page, I still have my line above and my line below, but now we have some of that padding, some of that additional space, top, bottom, right, and left. Well, apparently marketing is still not happy. They don't like the amount of space between those two lines. Well, we're going to add one more value. Again, in the Flare Style Sheet Editor, we're going to go in and we're going to change line height. By default, it has a value of 1. But what if we change that to 0.8 M units? As soon as we click Save, well, now those two lines just tightened up. But this is a pretty typical style if you go poking around in the actual code of the Style Sheet Editor. It's not uncommon for a single selector with a single class to have, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines of property pairs. That's actually pretty normal. Now, the good news, it wouldn't look anything that complex in the Flare editor. If I actually bring Flare back up for a second, what would it look like to do something like that? Well, if I were to go to AP Style, I'll double click and open that. If we come down to Borders, I can actually set borders as a group. There's a little group drop down, and I could say I want it to be a dark gray, 1 pixel, and solid. You can see that preview down below. If I want to adjust some padding, well, padding is also on the Borders tab. I'm just going to do a very quick demo. I'll just do like 10 pixels of padding all the way around. And now you can see I have that additional white space between the text and the box. So again, adjusting these styles, it's just an iterative process. But once you understand the box model, oh my gosh, at least now you have a fighting chance. And if I wanted the whole box to move to the right, well, then we would go to the Paragraph tab and adjust indentation left, and that would be the equivalent of margin hyphen left that Flare would write into the style sheet. If you want to adjust spacing before or after paragraphs, you would come down here, spacing before, spacing. Flare is going to write margin hyphen top, margin hyphen bottom. So Flare is going to write the correct syntax for you. All right, but that was kind of a being dropped into the deep end of the pool. That is the box model. Some final adjustments you might also need to be able to edit. How do we know which elements inherit? Best answer to that is go back and watch the first webinar, but the super short version, if you open a Flare topic and you look at that left-hand margin, basically any box that is inside of another box or any box that is to the right of another box is going to inherit from that box. Basically, this list item is a child of this ordered list, therefore it will inherit. This ordered list is a child of body, therefore that will inherit as well. So that is kind of how you can see those parent-child relationships. But this would take another 30 minutes to go through, but one of my favorite tools, Home Ribbon in the Flare interface. Go into the Styles area in the middle and open the Formatting window. that's going to open one of those helper panels over here on the right. If I want to know why my list items look the way they do, I will put my cursor in list item 1. Once my cursor is in list item 1, now I go over on the right and I can see all of the styles currently in play. So right now, I can see that the LI has margin bottom and margin top set. Then, inherited from its parent, the OL, well, there's a margin top and a margin bottom here, but those are being overwritten by the LI settings. But padding, all these padding values are being inherited. These margin values are being inherited. And then inherited from body is the text color and some other values. So I love this formatting window because it will help figure out, okay, why does this one line look the way it does? It shows you all the styles, literally what's being inherited by who and from which style sheet. Okay, in the next webinar, can I discuss style ID versus style class? Stay away from style ID. Don't use it, never use it, pretend you never heard of it until you get to a much more advanced level of CSS. Until you can answer that question yourself, you are just super safe sticking with classes. That's probably the highest level answer I can give to that question. All right, but we're going to wrap up. I need like 2 minutes. So if you want to justify text, maybe you want centered text. Well, there's a text align property. If you want to indent just the first line of a paragraph, this is tricky because if you look in the code and you look for first line indent, you won't find it, but you will find text indent. Not super intuitive. It sounds like the whole paragraph should indent. It doesn't. Text indent will give you a first line indent. And that's really going to wrap things up. I realize that was kind of a deep dive for some of you. But again, the things we covered, we talked about the importance of font families. Even if you're using one of those cloud-based Google fonts, it's still a good idea to develop a font family just in case those Google fonts go down for maintenance or, Google takes it away at some point in the future, anything like that. There is no magic font size. You have to pick the size that's best for your customers based on the font that you've chosen. You always use relative font sizing for web, but fixed font sizing for print. And it just dawns on me, I forgot to show you how to do that. So very briefly, I'll pull Flare back up. In a single style sheet, I would go to, for example, body. And right now my medium is set to default. I double click on body. Right now my size is 0.8 M units. Perfect. That's just what I want. That's going to be great for web publishing. But now I change my medium to print. And this is going to set me up to do a print specific override in this one style sheet. So now that I've switched over to the print medium, I'll double click on body. And now instead of an M unit, I could choose 10 point. Click OK and click Save. So now in a single style sheet, if I use the default medium, it will use a relative size. But then when I go to publish the PDF, I use the print medium and I get a fixed size. So that's how I'm able to do both types of publishing from a single style sheet. All right, so relative is for web, fixed font sizing is for print. Remember the box model when you're struggling to adjust white space. and get used to adjusting both margin and padding. You'll end up using them both a ton to get that look and feel that you want. All right, so that's going to wrap up. Somebody asked for a suggested reading list earlier. These are my 4 favorite books dealing with CSS right now. Probably my favorite for a beginner is this one. It's a little bit out of date by today's standards, but it's still applicable. And the thing I like about it is Lee and Boz, the authors, those are the 2 individuals who invented the CSS language those many years ago. So they have a very kind of unique perspective. If you want just a general kind of deep dive guide, then this first one is pretty good. But if you want something that is specifically written to the perspective of a technical writer, then this book by Scott DeLoach is one of my favorites. If you're not familiar with Scott DeLoach, he's pretty active in the Society of Technical Communication community. He writes several books aimed at technical writers. So where most CSS books are written from a webmaster's kind of point of view, Scott has written this one specifically from the point of view of a technical writer. And then the last book you should get, but it's one you almost always end up getting, is the good old O'Reilly. When all else fails, you can find it in the O'Reilly book, but they're expensive and they will hold your desk down in a tornado. They are massive. But those are my 4 favorite books. Question from Diane. Body is currently set to 1M. P is also set to 1M. Should I remove the font size from P? I would. The way I write my style sheets, if 80% of my text, if I want it to be, 1M unit and black, I will set my body style to be 1M unit and black and just let that inherit to paragraphs, to list items, to text in tables. Then I only write style properties if I need to deviate from that default behavior. So just by asking that question, Diane, I can tell you are on the right path. All right, almost done here. Some last things, some benefits for having been here. If you are in the market, and I'm not trying to sell anybody, it's just if you're in the market, let's try and save you some money. If you're talking to sales and you tell them that you attended this part 2 webinar, that entitles you to a discount. So don't forget to ask for that discount. And also, we are pre-announcing, we're hoping and praying that the world is going to get back to normal at some point. So we have already booked space. October of next year, we're going to be holding our Mad World conference, but instead of San Diego next year, it's going to be in Austin, Texas, kind of more central to the United States. So hopefully it's easier for more people to get there. I mean, we love holding it in San Diego where our headquarters is, but a lot of our East Coast customers, that's a long haul flight for them. And we do have a satellite office in Austin, so it's easy enough for us to coordinate there. So it will be in Austin next year. With that, I apologize. We went like 28 minutes long, but I am going to stick around. If anybody has any last minute questions for me, I'm happy to take those. But for everybody else that needs to log off and run, thank you so much for participating. I hope this was helpful. And keep your eye out. I believe we're posting part 3 of this series onto the website either this week or next. So make sure you get signed up for that one, and that will be in January. All right, I see a lot of thanks coming in, but I don't see any other question. Oh, are images covered in the future? Yes. In fact, that was somebody posted. It's already on the website. You can sign up for the webinar coming up in January. Part 3 of this series is going to be an entire hour just styling images. And in fact, it's going to be kind of a two-parter: how to style images such as screenshots that you have used as content, but then also how to use graphics and images as portions of your styles as well. So we're going to hit graphics from kind of both directions, and that will be in January. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions popping in, so thank you so much for those of you who are left. I think I am going to go ahead and close out the webinar now so we can start processing the recording, and hopefully we'll get that posted for session 2 up to the website. Maybe not today, maybe tomorrow, but we'll get that up if anybody wants to go back and review the recording. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day and an even better rest of your week. Cheers, everybody.